Hey there, Drew. Hey, Forrest. All right. Hey, Forrest, can you hear me?
I sure can. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yep, loud and clear. Hi, Cynthia. Hi, Mark. Hi, Drew.
Good morning.
Mark, are you able to hear us?
I hear you now.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Is it the middle of the night for you?
For me? No. I'm just on the west.
No, it's just evening.
Okay, good. So it's not too bad. And Drew, can you hear us all right? Drew, can you hear us? Drew, if you can hear us, we're not able to hear you. Okay. I'll keep on working with Drew. Thanks very much, everybody. I was a couple of moments late. The computer gave me a few glitches starting up. So let's see if. Okay. So we have already a number of people who are attending the webinar. Welcome. It's good to have you with us. We'll be getting started in just about 5 or 6 minutes. And as you can see, we have all of our speakers and panelists here who will be, and we'll be going through a few final logistical matters. So just bear with us and we'll be getting started with the webinar itself. So welcome everyone. It's wonderful to have you with us. My name is Fletcher Harper. I'm the Executive Director of Green Faith, which is an interfaith environmental organization. And we're very, very pleased to invite you or to welcome you to this first webinar that we've ever done on the intersection between faith and climate change, and an area of activity that broadly is being referred to as climate geoengineering, and as we'll learn from our expert panelists today, can be referred to and thought of in a number of different ways. This is a topic that's really brand new to religious and spiritual communities. One of our speakers today, Dr. Forrest Klingerman, is, to our knowledge, one of the first theologians who's been starting to pay attention to this and to promote dialogue among theologians. But it's a topic of real consequence, and it's a topic that religious and spiritual communities need to be aware of and need to learn to speak to. And I want to emphasize the learn, because this is something that's new that we all need to wrap our heads around. We have a really truly expert group of panelists today, and I'm going to introduce them sequentially as they speak. They each will share sort of something in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 to 15 minutes worth of thoughts from their particular perspectives. And after they speak, we're going to have an extended period of time for questions from members of the audience. I've also received a number of questions from people who are not able to be with us live, but who wanted questions posed. And so I'll be posing those to the panelists. For those of you on the line, if you want to send in a question, if you move your mouse over the screen, there are 2 ways you can submit a question. One is there's a little box at the bottom that says Q&A, and there's another box that says chat. You can type your question in either of those places, and that'll come to me, and I'll make sure that I pose that question. If I don't pose your question right away, it's for 2 reasons. One is that we are waiting till the end of the presentations to have the question and answer period. And the other piece is that I may be seeing 2 or 3 questions that are on a very, very similar topic, and I'm waiting for the right time to combine those into a single question. But rest assured, we are seeing everything that you're sending in, and we're eager to pose those questions. And if for some reason there's a question that you pose that we're not able to respond to right away, we will do our best to get the information that will enable us to respond, and then we'll send that back to you. We are recording the webinar, and the recording link will be sent to everybody who's registered for the webinar. And then you're invited to share that recording link with other colleagues that you think would be interested in learning and hearing about this. And we'll send that registration link out either later today or early tomorrow. The recording will be posted on Green Faith's YouTube page, and we'd welcome your sharing it widely. So without any further ado, I'd like to jump right in. Very briefly, our speakers today, who I'll introduce in greater detail when they each make their presentation. Dr. Forrest Klingerman, Dr. Mark Lawrence, Drew Jones, and Cynthia Scharf. Drew, we're going to start with you, and let me read a brief bio sketch so that everybody gets a sense of you. Drew Jones is the co-founder of Climate Interactive, which is a US-based think tank that does the math on the Paris Agreement and helps the world determine whether or not we're on track to address climate change. And Drew is going to talk more about Climate Interactive's work, which is really fascinating. A nice sidebar, in 2015, the Dalai Lama actually created a climate scenario in Drew's simulation model, which is called Sea Roads, that limited the temperature increase to 2 degrees C. So Drew has already enabled the Dalai Lama to limit climate change, which is great. And Drew lives with his family in Asheville, North Carolina. So Drew, welcome, and I'm going to bring up your slides so that you can start to take us through your presentation. And Drew, you're on mute, so you need to unmute yourself.
Sure do.
There you go.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and I have a pretty simple task here. I'm the motivation guy, and if you look at the numbers, you get very motivated to look for some new solutions. But look at this thermometer that we've set up here. You see the yellow line going towards a business as usual future. And that is, if we don't take significant action to address climate change, we're on track for a world of 4.2 degrees warming. That basically is a world we cannot adapt to. The level of migration, desertification, sea level rise, and changes in the economy, something that we just wouldn't be able to adapt to. We know we don't want to head there. The goal is to head towards the green line you see. And the goals that have been set forward are, can we limit warming to 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees? That's the range. See that fat green line. Our job, and actually the team, Mark, you work with the folks over at Potsdam Pick, another team in Germany has done the math to say, where are we headed given all of the actions that are planned and pledged around the world to address climate change? 195 countries made pledges to the United Nations saying, we're going to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases. We're going to build less coal-fired power plants and oil infrastructure and all these actions, energy efficiency, and we're going to restore our forests. Those actions, if you add up everything what everyone is pledged to do, would limit warming to somewhere around 3 or 3.3 degrees. So if you just squint your eyes at it, we've closed some of the gap, but not all of it. And so the motivation for what my colleagues are about to speak to is, as you probably have an intuition, we've made some progress. We have much, much further to go. So really, I set up the others who are speaking here to say, look at the difference between the blue line and the green line. Those two, that gap is really what we're here to address. How can we, through not burning coal, oil, and gas, how can we lower the future temperature? And what are the other measures that we're coming up with? And geoengineering is one of the things that's being considered now as a way to get us down towards the green. Now, one note, everything that you all do in your congregations, in your families, in your societies and countries, every time somebody doesn't eat a hamburger but eats a vegetarian meal or turns off the lights or buys a more efficient car, those are things that pull that blue line towards the green. And we're looking for the whole suite of opportunities to get us from the blue down to the green. So really, I don't even think we need the next slide. I think Fletcher, we could just say, there's the gap. What do we do about it? Listen to my colleagues, because we're starting to think more and more creatively about closing that gap.
That's great. Thanks, Drew. And just to prompt your thinking for the Q&A period, I've gotten some questions already from people saying, sort of struggling with the fact that in the aftermath of the Paris Agreement, a lot of people thought we've solved the problem, and now this uncomfortable awakening to the fact that we've started on that journey, but there's still an awfully long way to go. So
yeah.
I don't know if
One
there's
question,
anything.
Fletcher, are we able to type answers in the chat? Because maybe some of these, as they come up, we can start to,
Yep.
Or should we just wait to the end?
No, please do. I think it's good that
Okay.
as long as you don't feel that it's overly distracting, that's great. That's
Okay.
all good. All right, so Drew, you've set us up really nicely with with an overview of the fact that, as we've said, the Paris Agreement represents a start, but there's actually still a fairly daunting gap that needs to be addressed, and it's within that context that the topic of what I'm saying is calling climate geoengineering, but which I know experts are starting to refer to in different kinds of ways, has emerged, and we're very, very fortunate. As our next speaker to have Dr. Mark Lawrence, who's the scientific director at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, who's going to speak to us and give us an introduction to what climate geoengineering really is. Mark, for years, has focused on a range of sustainable development topics, helping people in the science world speak to people in the policy world and back and forth, and then also trying to support the development of a more robust and informed conversation between the scientific community and broader society. And Mark is the author or co-author of well over 100 peer-reviewed publications. He's led various international projects, served as the editor on several very well-respected journals. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And I wonder, as a starting point, could you give us a brief introduction to the climate geoengineering techniques that have been proposed, which might be in serious discussion within the context of fulfilling the goals of the Paris Agreement? And I'll pull your slides right up. But why don't I pass the microphone to you in response to that first opening?
Okay, thank you, Fletcher, very much for the opportunity to join this. My screen that says my internet connection is unstable, which is probably a function of me being here in Kathmandu, Nepal, but we hope that this is going to work out well. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you here. This is a continuation of an effort that I've been involved in for now over 5 years. Since almost exactly 5 years ago, we organized the first ever international workshop on spiritual and religious perspectives on climate engineering at the IASS, and that's where I also first met Forrest. So what I'd like to tell you about, if you can flip to the second slide, is some of the thinking that has come up as a consequence of the impending challenges that Drew just described. So Drew showed us this tremendous gap that we still have between where we want to be and where we're headed. That's led us to thinking about that us as a broad community, us not just being scientists, but being entrepreneurs, being policymakers, being people that come from all walks of life, especially those who feel threatened by this degree of climate change, to think about, are there other ways possibly to address climate change in addition to, not besides, mitigation? And this, of course, leads to quite controversial discussions. This revolves around two additional possible approaches to limiting climate change. And if you take a look at the figure, you'll see in the middle panel, the first of these approaches is the idea of somehow or another removing greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere. In the right panel is the other idea, and that is to do something else to the atmosphere or to the Earth's surface to get it to either reflect back more sunlight or let out more energy from the Earth. In other words, to cause it to cool off and counteract the effect of the warming of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. The one in the middle we call very simply carbon dioxide removal, since we focus mostly on carbon dioxide there, or CDR is the abbreviation for that. And the more far out ideas we call all sorts of different names. I'm calling them here radiative forcing geoengineering, since it's geoengineering of the radiative forcing of the atmosphere, or RFG for short. Other people, you might have heard other names like solar radiation management or albedo modification. Now, these two classes of techniques are very different from each other, but they're often referred to together, and that again under various names like geoengineering or climate engineering or climate geoengineering or climate interventions or large-scale manipulation. Some people just simply call it even crazy or playing God. Now, in contrast to mitigation, mitigation focuses on reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that gets into the atmosphere and reducing the amount of other climate forcers like black carbon and methane that get into the atmosphere in the first place. carbon dioxide removal would instead aim to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide after it's been emitted to the atmosphere. And the radiative forcing geoengineering techniques would aim to counteract greenhouse warming mostly by adding something, either particles to the atmosphere or mirrors in space. So among these carbon dioxide figures, carbon dioxide techniques that you see in the figure, Fletcher, are you showing the figure still? I don't see it on my screen anymore. I don't seem to see, I don't hear you either. Aha. Okay, so we have the figure again. If you take a look amongst the carbon dioxide removal techniques that are shown in the figure, there are 4 that we think would be physically capable of removing the most CO2. That would be combining bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which we call BECCS, bioenergy with CCS, or directly capturing CO2 from the air, which we call direct air CO2 capture and storage, or DACS, DACCS, or enhanced weathering, or ocean alkalization. Now, all the other techniques that are shown here, things like afforestation, producing biochar and burying it, enriching soil carbon levels, and ocean iron fertilization, would likely not be able to remove as much as these other 4, but still probably enough, or in some cases only possibly enough, to contribute to future climate policy measures. For the other techniques, the radiative forcing geoengineering techniques, while several of these techniques could physically provide a global cooling that would be equivalent to 0.5 degree or more, 0.5 degree Celsius, which is 1 degree Fahrenheit for those of you living in the country where I was born, only the 3 atmospheric techniques that are shown, that is putting particles in the stratosphere, which we call stratosphere aerosol injections, or modifying marine clouds and marine free sky, which we call marine sky brightening, or trying to make cirrus clouds thinner so that they let more radiation from the Earth through, which we call cirrus cloud thinning. Those are the only ones that are likely to be able to technically do so if they were ever pursued in the context of the Paris Agreement. Space mirrors and surface-based techniques would probably face prohibitive constraints like logistics, costs, timescales, ecosystem side effects, and so on. And one final point. All of these techniques face very substantial social, ethical, and governance challenges, which you'll hear about from my colleagues. I'd just like to make clear up front that I'm not a techno junkie trying to sell you on this, rather a scientist giving you some insight into what we know and what we don't know yet, while these socio-political and ethical aspects all concern me very deeply.
So Mark, that's a really helpful and clear and also substantial amount of information to help us with. Thank you very much. What is the timetable that we're talking about with this? How soon could we expect these kinds of proposed climate geoengineering techniques to make any kind of significant contribution to fulfilling the Paris Agreement? And what is the cost, or what would some of these approaches cost? Is that something that we know anything about?
Yes, we have a basic idea of these. There have been several literature studies, several scientific studies, and several literature assessments that have looked at this. They show that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, but what we can see with a relatively high degree of confidence is that it will take time before any of these techniques could be developed up to a scale that would have a substantial climate impact, if that is ever even desired. And that's a big if for many of these techniques. For the carbon dioxide removal techniques and for the radiative forcing geoengineering techniques, it's likely several decades before they get up to a scale that would have a substantial climate impact. For carbon dioxide removal, that's mostly because of the huge infrastructure that would need to be developed. Infrastructure that's on the same kind of in the oil industries. And also resolving issues like competition with other sectors like agriculture. For the radiative forcing geoengineering techniques, it would depend, first off, on improving our scientific understanding, on developing the technologies in the first place, since most of these are just on the drawing board, and especially on the extensive public and political discourse which we would need in order to develop effective governance mechanisms. At this point, it's actually unclear whether any of these techniques would ever function technically at the scales that are needed to really impact the climate. The implementation and operational costs of these techniques are also extremely uncertain, but the guesstimates, and I emphasize guesstimates, are somewhere around $100 per ton of carbon dioxide for most of the carbon dioxide removal techniques, plus or minus a lot on that. That would amount to something like $4 trillion per year to compensate our current emissions. The radiative forcing geoengineering techniques have been estimated to be able to be done at much lower costs, perhaps $100 billion per year, perhaps even less than that. But we don't know if those costs would ever be really achievable due to the technological challenges that could be faced when they're tried to be scaled up. And of course, there's all sorts of different social and environmental impacts and costs that would need to be considered.
Super. So we're talking about something that's really quite far off in the future then, Mark, and it might not even work or ever be affordable. Is that a fair way to try to summarize what you're saying?
Yeah, that's right. Think of it this way. The proposed climate geoengineering techniques could end up forming what we in the field call socio-technical imaginaries. It's a big term, but you can imagine what it means. It means that it's something that is a technical or technology that society imagines in the future, like hovering cars that were imagined for the year 2020 already, that could actually influence policy. And in this case, they are influencing policy. The concept of climate geoengineering is already having a significant impact on our collective imagination. You can see this through media reports and on policy, especially through the way that carbon dioxide removal is included in future scenarios and model simulations, and the way that the entire spectrum of climate geoengineering techniques are included in the IPCC assessment reports. But none of these exist at any kind of a climate relevant scale yet. And so due to the possible hindrances that could be encountered, scientific, technical, environmental, social, political, and otherwise, they might never exist or work as imagined at such huge global scales. But on the other hand, they might be spun up and they might be very active in climate policy in several decades from now. So similar to other controversial issues like genetic engineering, I think it's worth understanding what we might be facing on the technological front in future.
So, Mark, and I should say, Mark, that the switchboard, to use that sort of old phrase, the switchboard is lighting up with questions and people wanting to asking if you can repeat what you've said slowly 2 or 3 times to help them understand better. So I want to provide reassurances that everybody will get the recording link, and we'll also work to make some text available to help folks digest the remarkable amount of information that Mark is sharing with us. But Mark,
Gladly.
what are some from your perspective, what are the main next steps from a scientific perspective? And I also want to thank you, Mark, for noting that your role is not here as an advocate for these technologies, but as a scientist trying to educate us to understand them and how to think about them. So thank you for that. But what are some of the main next steps from your perspective as a scientific expert in this area?
Well, thanks, Fletcher. I'd also be very glad to repeat things in the Q&A session later, and we can certainly provide some text, including fact sheets on these technologies that we've put together. And I'll also emphasize that this is a real crash course. Normally, I don't talk about this in a talk that's anything less than 45 minutes long. So we're trying to get this over in a very short order to get you the main points. So I think there are 3 main next steps that we can highlight in terms of the work on climate geoengineering. First, it's not surprising coming from a scientist, but I think that we should highlight that further research on a lot of the scientific and the societal aspects would be of great value to help us have a better basis for informed political and public discussion. And second, in parallel to that research, we need to work on early development of effective governance, including governance for research, because this could help to reduce the likelihood and the extent of injustices that we might face. And it would allow for both supporters and critics of climate geoengineering technologies to voice their concerns. I think this is where the most intense immediate work on this topic is needed, and this is where we've decided to focus our current efforts for the next few years at the IASS. And third, based on my assessment of the current knowledge and the assessment of many of my colleagues, although there's disagreement within the scientific community, of course, I don't think that climate geoengineering techniques can be counted on to be able to make significant contributions towards counteracting climate change prior to the second half of the century. So when you think about what Drew just showed you, that the current promises for global mitigation efforts over the next 15 years are so limited that they leave global emissions basically constant or even slightly increasing until 2030, that they would leave us on a pathway for 3.3 degrees. If it stays that way, then even if some of the proposed techniques were to be, climate engineering techniques were to be pursued globally and eventually actually worked as envisioned on global scales, they'd likely be too late to help us keep the climate below 2 degrees and almost certainly too late for the 1.5 degree target. So at present, my third point of what we really need to focus on is realizing the only reliable way to achieve the Paris Agreement goals is to considerably, tremendously increase the mitigation efforts that we're carrying out beyond the current plans.
That's really super, Mark, and thank you. I mean, it's really a masterful job of summarizing a lot of complicated information in a really accessible way. And I've had the benefit of having your text and having had the chance to hear you speak before about this. So but I know that there is a lot of benefit for folks that will come from hearing your presentation about this and your reminder about the crucial importance of scaling up and accelerating our mitigation efforts. So thank you so much for that. And to all of you who've sent in the scientifically oriented questions, I want to promise you we will get to those. And we want to, I think, keep the flow of our presenters going now, but then we'll have a nice amount of time after our presenters to begin raising the questions that you all have sent in. So thank you for that. I'd like to turn the microphone now over to our good friend Cynthia Scharf, who's the Senior Strategy Director for the Carnegie Climate Geoengineering Governance Initiative, which is also known in the field as C2G2, which sounds like a wonderful Star Warsian kind of reference. And Cynthia is also a fellow with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Cynthia previously served as the head of strategic communications and chief speechwriter on climate change for the United Nations Secretary General from 2009 to 2016. And we'll just say personally that she just did an absolutely spectacular job in that role. She played a key role in the Secretary General's 2 global climate change summits in 2009 and 2014, and advised the Secretary General during the UNFCCC negotiations, including the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015. C2G2 is a unique initiative, and Cynthia is going to speak more to this, but there are several key goals. One is to encourage this kind of society-wide discussion about these geoengineering technologies and their governance. Second is to advance the conversation with governments and with international organizations, including the UN, so that they start creating some rules about how geoengineering research should or should not be conducted. And Cynthia has emphasized to me over and over, and I'm sure she will again, that C2G2 is impartial. It doesn't take a stand on whether geoengineering is good or bad, or should or shouldn't be used, because C2G2 believes that society needs to make that decision. So Cynthia, welcome and thank you so much. And we heard Mark's presentation. What's from where you sit within C2G2, what's the chance from your perspective that solar geoengineering could be deployed in the next 10 to 20 years? And is there anything at all on the books now to stop someone who wants to just give it a try from trying this out at some kind of scale? That's an opening one for you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Fletcher, and to all participants on this webinar. Let me just start by saying I wish we never had to talk about this. And I say that with all sincerity. I wish that our efforts to date would keep us on the path that countries promised in the Paris Agreement. And I know that many of the participants on this webinar have probably spent years, if not longer, working on issues that are of deep concern to them from a faith perspective. And we all wish that we were not in a situation where the world is discussing speculative emerging technologies that potentially could help reduce global temperatures, but also have extremely high levels of risk, both known risks and unknown risks. So just wanted to make that kind of introduction that none of us wants to be in a situation where we would have to seriously consider deploying some of these technologies. But as Mark and Drew described in greater detail, we are in a very, very serious situation as a global community with respect to our efforts on climate change. And this isn't about just our generation or our children's generation, but really it's about all generations going forward. Because the truth of the matter is the amount of CO2 that is already in the atmosphere will continue to change the climate for up to 1,000 years or even several millennia. So we're talking about the foreseeable future and much longer. So the implications of the work that Green Faith does and that all of you do in bringing together faith communities around issues of environmental concern and on climate change is really pivotal, because the consequences are millennia long. So with that introduction, let me get to your question. Solar geoengineering, Mark has described various methods for doing that. Scientifically, we've heard estimates that potentially within 15 to 25 years, some form of credible solar radiation management, particularly one specific technology, which also has a very complicated name to it. The acronym is SAI. It stands for Stratospheric Aerosol Injection. This is the solar technique that most scientists are focusing on at the moment. It attempts to mimic what happens when there's a large-scale volcanic explosion and large amounts of sulfate aerosols come into the atmosphere and reflect sunlight, thereby cooling the earth. What makes this technology so seductive, and I use that word on purpose, is that it's really one of the only set of techniques that could potentially cool the earth in a very, very short number of years, something under on the range of 5 years. Nothing out there that we are currently aware of could cool the earth in that rapid of a time frame. Secondly, compared to the costs of decarbonizing the global economy, the billion plus, and I say billions plus, price tag for this kind of technology by comparison seems much less expensive. Now, I'm just focusing on the direct costs here. As Mark very accurately described, there are huge, huge risks with this technology that some are even unknown and some are known at this point. So the indirect costs of using something like this could be massive. But when I said the word seductive, I'm speaking to both the quick impact and the lower cost, or at least perceived lower direct cost of this technology. And there will be something, I'm sure, in the future. We can't say when, but it might be decades from now. It could be in the next century. But at some point, there will be something I call the do something moment, where the climate impacts that are affecting particular communities or populations become so severe that communities clamor to their elected officials, to their governments, to do something that will help alleviate the suffering that we are feeling. And in that context of crisis, there could be the temptation to try something like solar geoengineering with the very untested potential promise of reducing global temperatures quite quickly. And there is the false assumption, and I underscore false, that this could provide a quick technical fix and may not cause us to change our lifestyles significantly. That is absolutely not the case. The only way one could credibly use solar geoengineering is in addition to reducing emissions, which is the very first and most essential step, as both Drew and Mark have described, and also in removing carbon that is already in the atmosphere. Because solar geoengineering does not address the cause of human-caused climate change. It's not sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. All it's doing is masking the amount of solar radiation that comes into our planet and thereby cooling. One might think of it as an umbrella or as a very high-intensity suntan lotion. I'm looking for the kind of popular metaphor here to describe what this might mean, but the main point is it is not addressing the cause of human-caused climate change, and therefore could only be done in conjunction with the things we know we have to do, starting with reducing our emissions. To come to the second part of your question, is there governance surrounding these suite of technologies? Unfortunately, the short answer is no. There is nothing that is comprehensive or systematic currently on the books in a multilateral arena or even in a national government that would specifically prohibit an actor from using or attempting to deploy some of these solar geoengineering technologies. These are emerging technologies, and what we've found in talking to policymakers around the world, and we're talking to folks both within the UN processes, which we know pretty well as people in national governments, in governments at the provincial or regional or state level, and of course with civil society and faith communities. There is at the moment a low level of awareness that these technologies are being developed, and in particular that some of the scientific assessments that the IPCC, which is an acronym for a much longer name, but in brief is the scientific body that co-shared the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2007, the models that the IPCC used to keep the world under a 2-degree temperature rise heavily relied on some of these geoengineering technologies, not the solar technologies, but the technologies that seek to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. So on a technical level, there is discussion within the scientific community that these kinds of technologies could well be needed to keep us on track to stay under 2 degrees. That level of awareness is currently not shared by the policymaking community. And therefore, that is really the purpose of our initiative, is to meet with these policymakers, inform them about the emergence of these technologies, and to urge them to start talking about what kinds of rules of the road, what kind of guardrails would be needed to govern these technologies, because the fact is they have planetary-wide impacts. So we're talking about technologies that are extremely powerful and that would affect every country on Earth, and therefore need to be discussed in a multilateral forum like the United Nations, where every government has a chance to express their views, to ask questions, and to contribute to governance. So I'll stop right here, and I'm happy to take further questions from you, Fletcher, or from participants.
No, that's great, Cynthia. And perhaps whether now or later there are questions that have come in from people asking us to think about what are some of the questions of justice and human rights that potentially are put into play by the possible use of geoengineering in its various forms. Is there anything you'd like to say preliminarily or at this stage about that, or should we give you a couple of moments to gather thoughts? What works best for you?
Sure, I'm happy to take a stab at that. Some of the key questions, they're different for the different suite of technologies. So for the carbon removal technologies, there are issues that are fairly prosaic about how would you measure this, what kind of methodology might be used, what kind of accounting system might be developed so that if country X says that it's removing 1 ton of CO2, is that the same as country Y saying that they do so? So just a comparability of efforts requires that there's a shared framework of methodologies and accounting systems. And those are things that can be fairly easily handled within the UNFCCC, which is the body that oversaw the development of the Paris Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, and the current governance we have around climate change. But beyond the fairly prosaic governance on these technologies, there are issues about transboundary impacts. So for example, if the world were to decide to deploy the technology called BECCS, which stands for Bioenergy, Carbon Capture and Storage, it would require a huge amount of land dedicated solely to growing biofuels, which would then be burned in a factory, captured, and then stored underground. That would require land use on the order of something like the size of India, or potentially larger. So enormous tracts of land dedicated to solely this purpose. So you can see just at the outset what kind of transboundary issues you might be talking about here. Land use, effects on agriculture and food security, which Mark mentioned, potential impacts on migration, on human rights concerns. Do the affected communities have a say in this? So there are very serious issues that span beyond just national governance, but really truly at a multilateral effect. So those are very serious issues that would have to be taken up in environments such as the United Nations and the UNFCCC if these technologies were ever developed at this scale that would be needed to make a real impact in the atmosphere. The governance for solar geoengineering and the questions there are quite different, but the commonality here is that these are planetary-wide technologies and therefore need to be discussed in a global arena because every country on Earth would be impacted. Now, the catch there is they would be impacted, but there would be different impacts, different levels of impact in different regions. So at least from what we understand right now from the research, there would be global winners and losers from using solar radiation management. And that would, of course, lend itself to a discussion in a multilateral arena so that all countries could discuss questions about who decides, whose hand is on the global thermostat, who's setting that thermostat, at what level. If we think about just in our own lives, maybe your family is like mine, we often have disagreements about what the temperature should be in our living room or in the family room during the winter season. So if we have those disagreements at a family level, imagine what it might be like at a global level where countries are wrestling with how much do we want to dial down the Earth's temperature, and what impacts might that have on my country and on other countries at the same time. So this gets into extremely difficult questions about how and who makes the decision whether this kind of a technology might ever be used. Who would make the decision how to potentially try to wean ourselves from these technologies so that they're not used in perpetuity? How would they be governed? Who would deploy the technologies? What kind of aircraft would be needed? Who would own those aircraft? Lots of questions, but basically centering on who makes these decisions, how are they made, are they inclusive, do they include every single country, do they include the voices and views of some of those populations that might be seriously negatively affected by this, as well as those who could potentially benefit from a technology like this. So there are extremely important issues here about justice, about equity, about governance of decision-making that definitely would need to be addressed at a society-wide level.
Cynthia, perhaps say just a few things, and again, thank you so much for these sort of really thoughtful and substantive inputs. Can you paint a little bit more of a picture for us about what C2G2 is doing on this issue? We know you're talking to governments and the United Nations about creating some kind of guardrails. Could you say a little bit more about what you're doing and give us a little bit of a fuller picture about that?
Sure, I'm happy to. So I just wanted to again stress what Fletcher already mentioned. The purpose of our initiative is to inform and expand the conversation about geoengineering technologies so that it broadens beyond the scientific research community and really starts moving into the policymaking arena. Because even though we're looking at several decades at best for some of these technologies to be developed, the fact is that policymaking, particularly at the global level, takes quite a bit of time. And as I said earlier, there is a very, very low level of awareness at the moment that these technologies are being developed, are being discussed in the scientific arena. And so we don't want to be in a situation where the development of technology really outpaces our ability as a society to govern these technologies. So we believe that it is more important and it is in the benefit of all to have this discussion with policymakers now, before we're at a moment where country X or actor Y says, this is the do something moment, we need to go ahead with this. We believe there's a much greater danger of not talking about this now and trying to get ahead of this issue and putting some rules of the road in place so that we are not caught in a situation where something might be at a level where it could potentially be deployed and we don't have the policies in place to govern that. So what specifically are we doing? First of all, we're doing a lot of kind of awareness raising and education with policymakers, both in various departments of the United Nations, with also national governments, with subnational governments, and with folks like many of you here on the webinar today, who are involved in a civil society level about informing, educating, and raising awareness of some of these issues. So that's the first step in what we're doing. Excuse me. We're also heavily involved in talking to policymakers in various processes of the United Nations system. So Fletcher, you might want to switch to the slide that has the number of arrows within it, describing some of these processes. So this, as I mentioned before, is at the UNFCCC, which is the global entity for looking at the Convention on Climate Change. That was the framework surrounding the development of the Paris Agreement. As you see there in the top row, the middle block in the top row, UNFCCC. And that would be the appropriate entity for discussing how we govern the carbon removal technologies. Again, on the top row, there is also a UN body called the Convention on Biological Diversity. And they've already taken up some of the issues about carbon removal, but in a rather piecemeal fashion. There is nothing systematically and comprehensive in place at the moment for looking at some of the carbon removal technologies and specifically for governing some of the research on that. So we are working with the Convention on Biological Diversity to help policymakers create governance around the research on some of these technologies. And on the very right, on the top level there, we also have as a long-term goal catalyzing some kind of a discussion within the UN General Assembly, UNGA for short. Why? The simple reason is the UNGA is the most universal body that is currently operational. It includes every single country in the world, as well as some permanent observers. And we feel that if there were ever to be a serious discussion about using solar geoengineering technologies, that there would need to be a discussion in the world's most universal body about how we might decide to use those, who makes the decision, how is it governed, how is it potentially deployed. So several years down the road, we hope we could catalyze a discussion at the UN General Assembly about this technology, or this suite of technologies. We're also working with the UN Environment Assembly, which is the governing body for UN Environment, headquartered in Nairobi. It is not the most universal body, but it is the most universal body in terms of environmental issues. So we are working with them and hope to kickstart a discussion about solar geoengineering and what kind of governance might be needed around that in some kind of a resolution within the UN Environment Assembly next year, 2019. We're also working with other processes outside the UN system, so talking with actors who are involved in or members of bodies such as the African Union, the European Community, the OECD, the G20, all these various acronyms that you see listed on the screen. And on the research side, we're also discussing with some of the international research bodies or foundations about how we might govern the research of some of these technologies. So we are looking at multiple processes, multiple arenas. There is no one-size-fits-all governance body for all of these technologies, and therefore we're looking at a number of them and speaking with them, as well as national governments, about how to go forward.
Well, thank you, Cynthia. That's really a very full plate, it sounds, and we appreciate your diligence and also the clarity with which you've described this issue of governance and how much that matters. I'd now love to turn the microphone over to Dr. Forrest Klingerman. Forrest is Associate Professor of Religion and Philosophy at Ohio Northern University, and along with Kevin O'Brien is the editor of a book of essays entitled Theological and Ethical Perspectives on Climate Engineering, Calming the Storm. And Forrest has done as much work as anybody on the planet in the theological community, beginning to gather theological responses and reflections in relationship to geoengineering. And it's wonderful to have you with us, Forrest. Tell us first, from your perspective, why should faith communities explore climate engineering? How is it a theological and an ethical issue? What kind of impact does it have on our theologies and ethics?
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for organizing this. Fletcher, when you said that I've done almost as much as anybody on the planet, that makes it sound much more impressive than it is. There's been very little work that's been done on religion and climate engineering, which on the one hand sounds negative, but on the other hand, it does mean that there's a great possibility, and there's a big opening that I think faith communities, theologians, ethicists have to rise to. In terms of why faith communities, why theologians, ethicists should deal with this, I think a lot of it comes down to why faith is important. Faith is pivotal in how we understand, how we think, how we feel about the world, about ourselves, about the other, and capital O other, the sacred, the divine. So religion gives us kind of some guideposts for understanding and interpreting our relationship with nature. Religion, for example, gives us some ways of framing climate engineering that otherwise we're not going to have. It's already been mentioned, is climate engineering a way of playing God? That conversation about climate engineering as playing God is something that comes up quite frequently, but very few people actually recognize how religious that might sound, or how important it is to actually bring faith communities into the conversation about what we mean when we say we're playing God. We can frame climate engineering in terms of hubris, in terms of human flourishing, in terms of healing, in terms of reconciliation, in terms of salvation. All of those things mean something to the religious community, And I think the religious communities, all religious communities, bring something different, bring some different narratives to the table. Another thing that religion does that's pretty important to recognize is that religion, different faiths influence how we understand our sense of self. Our sense of self as agents, our sense of self as creatures. So each faith community comes to the table with a sense of why climate engineering is a better or worse way of understanding who we are, of how our sense of self might be affected. I come from a Christian background. As someone who's working within Christian theology, climate engineering really has asked me questions of how we're creatures of capability on the one hand and fallibility on the other, of how we have powers, we have certain responsibilities, we can go to great heights, but at the same point in time we also fail, and we also have obligations, we also are far too often fallible. So when you begin to think of how faith dictates or how faith engages our sense of self, we begin to see climate engineering in a different light. A third thing that is important is religion influences our eschatological or our teleological sense, especially of our materiality, our bodies, and the environment around us. So if we begin to think of climate engineering in terms of a greater sense of meaning and purpose, of a sense of where we're going, the purpose of climate engineering kind of takes a different tone. So is the purpose of climate engineering simply to maintain business as usual, something Cynthia has already said? No, it certainly can't. We can't simply say climate engineering is supposed to somehow allow us to continue doing things as we've done. But if it's not to maintain a business as usual, is it really appropriate, or should we think of climate engineering as an act of redemption, as a humanitarian act? How do we take what Cynthia said is the seductive nature of climate engineering? All these questions really start percolating when you begin to think of it in terms of faith commitment rather than from a philosophical or simply a governance-oriented approach.
And so, Forrest, building on that sort of foundational lay of the land that you've given us, there have been discussions on this topic among a small group of theologians. You've been part of that, and there've been. My guess is that there have been at least a few points of consensus that have begun to emerge, or are there key points of consensus that you can share that you've seen start to emerge from the community of theologians and ethicists who've started to talk about this? And are there significant points of difference? And whether you get to this now or whether we address it later, there have also been several questions about what traditions and perspectives have been included in these theological discussions so far. Is it largely Christian? Have there been indigenous and First Peoples voices, Global South theological and spiritual voices? So let me, without wanting to make the question too broad, what would you say to that set of questions?
Right. Well, I don't think that this has come up in our webinar thus far, but the conversation overall about climate engineering is really, really fast moving, and it's relatively recent. It became, it went from being something that a few people were talking about to being something that scientists and policymakers could really begin to think about it in 2006 with a rather famous paper. And so when you think, here we are in 2018, 2006 being the time when suddenly exponentially the research started to grow, there hasn't been a lot of things done in terms of religion, in terms of theology. There have been a few, however. And there's been some really, really important meetings. The first of its kind, was one that Mark organized in Potsdam that he has already mentioned. That was a much more interreligious conversation than some of the subsequent ones. And that really was trying to test the waters to see what conversations might emerge. It was a really, really fruitful conversation as a result of that. From there, another conversation that has happened was the Seizing the Alternative conference in Claremont in 2015. And at that conference, there were several of us that gathered together to talk about climate engineering from a theological and an ethical perspective, from a religious ethical perspective. That conversation was incredibly fruitful because it was in the context of a larger conference, but it was also a group of people meeting over 3 or 4 days to talk through some of the essays that became the book, Theological and Ethical Responses. In that conversation, we came up with some points of consensus. In spite of the fact that there was a lot of debate and disagreement, there were certain things that just kept bubbling up. And a third thing third conversation that's occurred was actually in the most recent CEC 17 conference, which was looking at climate engineering in a very broad sense. There was a conversation there about religion and climate engineering that actually you, Cynthia, and Mark participated in. A lot of the points of consensus that came out of Claremont were reiterated at that meeting. And so it seems like there's certain things that are really emerging as important for religious communities, for faith communities to discuss. Here's a couple of them. Here's a list of a few that are probably useful for the people in this webinar to begin to think about. First and foremost, in all of these conversations, religion is seen as an important voice. Religion, it's currently not a very strong voice in the conversation, but it's a pivotal voice. It matters to people. It's something that many people across the globe find as fundamental to their lives. Religion matters. At the same point in time, religious communities need to navigate the pluralism of the public square. And that addresses some of what you're asking with who's actually in the conversation. Right now, the conversation has been primarily, not exclusively, among Christian theologians and ethicists. But there has to be much more of a recognition of the pluralism of the public square, of the need to have a multiplicity of religious voices in investigating this topic. A second thing that came up both in Claremont and in Berlin at CEC 17 is that a big part of the voice that religious communities offer is that faith communities give us stories, narratives, metaphors, models. Faith communities, religious commitment gives us unique ways of speaking about things, unique stories that aren't artificial, but rather have a much more organic and lived sense to them. Those kinds of stories are going to be essential for understanding climate engineering. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of work about how to frame climate engineering. Religion offers us a much more natural way to understand climate change through the stories that it offers, through the narratives that it offers. A third thing that came up, and this I think has been something that we've heard several of our speakers already say, is that there was a very clear recognition of the moral ambiguity of climate engineering. Climate engineering, a lot of people, when they first hear about climate engineering, have a knee-jerk reaction against it, and in many respects, that's incredibly healthy. I think most scientists would agree that that's incredibly healthy. But at the same point in time, to just simply say no and close the door doesn't fully engage in the topic, and it leaves some of the ethical and policy decisions to be made by people that don't have that same kind of worry or concern. But that's also not to say that we should just wholeheartedly embrace climate engineering. Really, there is a moral ambiguity, and religious communities can offer some sense of how to approach moral ambiguity. That's something that they do quite well. A fourth thing that kind of came as a point of consensus is that climate engineering can't or shouldn't take the place of other responses to climate change. That's obviously something that that has been repeated in this webinar. It's something that you find throughout the literature. Climate engineering, it should not be the techno fix that allows us to continue to live in the way that we have been living with regard to our carbon emissions. A fifth thing that has kind of come up as a point of consensus was that religious communities have a responsibility, but at the same point are very well equipped to wrestle with topics of power and privilege. There is lots of concern around who gets to control climate engineering, who has the privilege to decide that this is what we should do rather than something else. Power and privilege is inherent in the conversation around climate engineering. Religious communities, for instance, again, my own, from a Christian perspective, religious communities have seen the need to have solidarity with the oppressed. Religious communities have seen the importance of not simply speaking on behalf of the powerful, but rather to speak on behalf of the powerless. That's something that religious communities have a responsibility to do when we're talking about climate engineering. And then finally, a point of consensus that has come up over and over again is that faith commitments provide us an avenue for deep discussions about our own culpability and how that culpability plays itself out both conceptually and ritually. Right? We are responsible for the reason that climate engineering is even being discussed. So how is it that we begin to talk about reconciliation, atonement, redemption, metanoia? All of those things are unique ways that religion can offer a voice.
Thanks very much, Forrest, and many thanks to Mark and Drew, who've been working overtime responding to comments in the chat box, which is great. And I'd encourage those of you who haven't had a chance to read through their comments, which have been really helpful amplifications to things that they've said, and also which include some useful source material links, which we'll share in the email when we share the recording link with everybody as well. We have only about 7 or 8 minutes left, and so I'm going to try. Many of the questions that have been raised have been responded to in the chat box, but I would say, and Mark, I might call on you for this one, although all of you are very well qualified to address it. The topic of moral hazard, the idea that there's a real concern that if we have this vision of a technological solution, that political, cultural incentives for mitigation efforts really decrease. Offer, if you would, Mark, just a couple of thoughts about that and how you think about that issue of the moral hazard, which is a huge one that emerges really quickly when geoengineering gets the floor.
Sure, gladly, Fletcher. And I've given a few links to that also in the window, the chat window, in case people are interested in looking into more. I don't know that I'm the most qualified for answering that. However, I don't know if anybody's really qualified for answering that. What surveys have been finding so far is that the response to hearing about climate geoengineering is very culturally sensitive. It's very age group, very education, very status level, very economic level sensitive. It seems that there is the width of responses, the breadth of responses from one end of people saying, well, basically what Newt Gingrich once said, well, look, why do we even have to punish our people and make them not drive their big cars and continue burning coal? We'll just let our brilliant scientists solve the problem. They'll have it fixed in a couple of years. To the far other end, people saying, oh my goodness, are scientists really seriously talking about that? Is this all the way up to where policymakers and religious leaders are talking about it? Maybe we had better get ourselves in gear and start eating vegetarian instead of meat, high meat diets. Start taking the train instead of taking the car everywhere. Start doing whatever we can in our daily lives and encouraging our policymakers to push through the policy. So both ends are things that show up when people talk about this moral hazard, and we don't know which of those is dominant yet globally.
Cynthia, I might ask you to add a few thoughts. You and I have had some conversations offline about this. What would your perspective be on the moral hazard question?
Thank you. I agree with all the comments that Mark just raised right there. This really cuts to the heart of our mission as an initiative. Our view is that there is a greater risk in not having the conversation now than in initiating the conversation. As I mentioned earlier, there is concern that some of these technologies not only are being seriously discussed within some of the IPCC's scientific models, but that increased public interest in them might compel policymakers to attempt to use them. And we feel it's extremely important to have a discussion with all sectors of society, including faith communities, for the very reason that Forrest mentioned, so that there are some rules of the road in place should deployment ever actively be considered. So we would argue that the risk is greater in not talking about them than it is in discussing them.
Let me raise another question, and I'll invite each of you to respond to this briefly, and perhaps use this because of our time constraint as a chance for any final thoughts you'd like to share also. And this is a question that Green Faith has pondered deeply and thought about even as we considered organizing and holding this webinar. It's an abiding concern for us that control of these technologies and the discussion around them and the development of them is very likely, because the world is the world, to be controlled by global elites, possibly by very powerful vested financial interests, political interests that may not be so supportive of the agenda around a sustainable future that we believe in quite deeply. And for reasons also that have been raised in some of the questions, that representation is in these debates, the voices around the table may really be missing. And we've talked about this in our prep, the fact that all of us here on this webinar are white global northerners. What would any of you speak to or say to that, as, you know, what should we be doing to make sure that the right voices are at the table? And how should we be thinking about these issues of who's getting to talk in the context of these conversations? And also use this as a chance for any closing thought that you'd like to share. Drew, I want to make sure we get your voice in this too, not necessarily first, but you've been really patient having kicked us off so well.
If you'd like, I can take a first stab at it.
Sure.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think just the example of this morning's webinar is one of the best examples. First of all, just educating ourselves about the emergence of these technologies and bringing in a different part of the global community that may not always be addressed when thinking about policy development. So the voices of faith communities from around the world are critically important, and those particularly from a non-Western perspective. There are other initiatives out there that are specifically looking at holding these conversations in developing countries. We sometimes work with them. We work with a number of international NGOs to try to broaden the conversation to something beyond a conversation among global elites in Western societies. The reality is that I think different cultures and nationalities are going to respond in ways that we may not normally be predicting. For example, countries that are most affected by the impacts of climate change and stand to be increasingly affected by climate change impacts potentially could be quite interested in the discussion of technologies, because the reality is we are very far from where we need to be in terms of meeting the Paris goals. And I go back to this notion again that the idea, the false idea, that there is a quick fix could be enticing to people who are suffering the most from these kinds of effects. I underscore again the word false solution, but there are very, very serious concerns we have to have about what their suffering entails already. And I think that's an important dimension to bring into this conversation, that climate impacts are already happening. They hurt the poor first and worst, and therefore they definitely need to be a part of this global conversation. And that's why we hope to move the conversation in the policy arena to places like the UN General Assembly, where all countries are there, to the UN Environment Assembly, where the vast majority of the world's governments participate. So again, bringing in as many governments, as many parts of society as possible into this conversation.
Thanks. Maybe Drew, then Mark, then Forrest. Any thoughts either on that question or closing thoughts, just in a minute or so each?
Yeah, so I think one of the most exciting things that's happened in the last 2 years in the climate movement was the Standing Rock protests. People saying, we want to prevent climate change. We are going directly at the source of it and keep the coal, oil, and gas in the ground. This whole movement, and led by indigenous peoples from multiple groups. It was amazing and powerful and really inspirational. So building on some of that energy, there can be other places where this group of people, the most vulnerable, have a powerful voice in the movement to prevent climate change, and could have a powerful voice in this whole discussion of, if it gets pushed to it, like how to handle these questions of geoengineering. So there's a precedent, and the world can build on that precedent. Moral leadership from the most vulnerable.
That's great, Drew. Thank you, and well taken. Mark, you've educated us in a remarkable way today. Any closing thoughts or observations you'd like to share?
Yes, Fletcher, I have two thoughts, adding to the wonderful points that Drew and Cynthia just made. The first one is on your question about involving a broader community. And I would post back Sonia Ingram's post that she just put up in the question. And Sonia, I was the leader of the European Transdisciplinary Assessment of Climate Engineering in 2015. And your question is, should we not focus on solutions that will work to stop climate change and its impacts on the planet and the people? And I say, yes, we should focus, absolutely. Our greatest focus, our greatest effort should definitely be on mitigation. But because of the fact that there will be discussion around alternative solutions, this is the way that we think as humans, and people will be looking for alternate possibilities. And because of the fact that perhaps some of these in the long term could help to contribute, especially direct air capture, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere after we don't succeed in mitigation, we should put some effort now, but it should be a limited effort. And this is where I come back to Fletcher's point, excuse me, how much and how should we involve other communities? I think we should be absolutely open to involving any communities that are interested in discussing this, but I think we should also make sure that we keep the focus really on mitigation efforts and bring this up as a topic that is on the horizon. And I think I'll mention the other point briefly. We need intermediaries. We scientists, when we lead 200-page reports, we can hardly see the forest through the trees. And I do my best to communicate it as clearly as possible in a short way as possible. But we need people who can really be intermediary communicators who can bring across the scientific information to a broader public as well as possible.
Thanks very much, Mark. Forrest, over to you for a final thought.
Yeah, actually, I just want to pick up on what Mark just said about the need for intermediaries. I think a thing that faith leaders, theologians, ethicists can do is really to act as intermediaries. And so what that amounts to is the recognition that there are people that are left outside the conversation, that there are people that aren't at the table in the discussions. Those questions about who's being represented, who has power, who has privilege, that's something that the faith community really has to be responsible for. And I think that in the past, we can look at all sorts of other movements and see how faith communities have really been able to rise to that challenge and deliberate in a way that's unique, thoughtful, and shows an alternative. Shows an alternative to kind of the clear-eyed, quote unquote, sensible thinking that might lead us to things that we don't actually want.
Well, we're a couple of minutes over our appointed time, and so I'm going to unfortunately have to stop this really remarkable conversation and thank Forrest and Cynthia and Mark and Drew for taking the time to share so substantively and so thoughtfully about this issue, this emerging collection of issues, what it means, what some of the various serious implications of it are. It's a topic that is an extremely challenging and sobering one, and you all have helped us start this conversation. And because of the literally the sort of God-playing sort of dimension of this, I want to invite us all at the end to invoke the facilitator's privilege and to ask if we might just take a moment together in reflection, in silent prayer, in meditation, in whatever we all might do. If we just take 20 seconds or so together as a way of acknowledging what we've heard, what we've discussed, and the importance of it. So please join me in that, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you all again very, very much for joining us. Thanks to our wonderful speakers, to all of the audience. We look forward to continuing this conversation. Take care and be well. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.